Y'all, I found these at the nursery, and I tell you, when I went right by them, they called my name. These are really beautiful violas. I paired them with some cabbage, some decorative cabbage, ornamental cabbage, and I thought the purples would go together well. So I just love these violas. A lot of people think of them as spring flowers, but I always think of them as fall flowers because they do so well here in the South during the fall through part of the winter. Depending on how mild the winter is, they can last all the way through. So that's my inspiration. Let's go paint some violas.
Welcome on in to Viv's Art and Garden. Now I have a 140-pound cold pressed watercolor paper, and I think it's a 5x7. And what I did was I drew an oval on it first, and then I just drew in some violas. What I've done is I've just mixed up a little bit of cerulean blue in a lot of water, and I'm just going to paint the background first. And that is, I'm going to stay within the lines of the oval and of course go around my violas and around the leaves of what I've drawn. So that's going to be our very first step. Once I get all this done, I'm going to let the background dry. So that is our first step. Well, second step. The first step is to draw your design. So I'm being really careful to go around all of the flowers and leaves and stems and also stay within that oval that I drew first. Now, I really love violas. They are beautiful. They're similar to pansies. Pansies, of course, the flowers are much, much larger. Violas are tiny, but they are very prolific with their blooms and their blossoms. So I really do like them. A lot of people use them in the spring. I use them in the fall because they're pretty tough, pretty hardy. Those and pansies and the ornamental cabbage, they can usually make it through most of the winter. As long as our winter is mild here in the South. Now, if we get some hard freezes and stuff like that, then yeah, of course, it's going to take them out. But generally, they do well at least until Thanksgiving, most times. So I'm almost finished with my oval, the background of the oval. Now you can see better how I just stayed inside the oval that I drew. But I drew my pansies to kind of stick outside of the oval. Not pansies, violas, to stick outside, and some of the leaves stick outside of the oval just to give it some interest. Now I let that background dry completely. You don't want a big old mess with your paint bleeding together. And now I've mixed up a reddish purple with a darker purple. And I'm using the wet on wet technique. I love that technique because it is just so spontaneous. So I wet the petal with clean water, and then I've just dropped in some of that reddish purple, and I just kind of let it flow. And where I want it to be lighter, I am just lifting some of the paint. All I'm doing is drying off my brush, and then I went back in there and was just like pulling up some of that paint and then wiping it off onto my little paper towel there. Then I went where I wanted it to have a darker shadow, and I just touched, while it's still wet now, I touched that really deep purple just right along the edge where I want that shadow. We're going to do the same thing on the next purple petal. I'm trying not to let the two petals bleed together, I'm trying to keep a small little space of white right between just right between the two petals. And later on I can come back and do a wash over it so that it's not stark white in between there. Again, while it's still wet, I'm adding that deeper, darker purple, and that leans a little bit more toward the blue than it does toward the reddish purple. And I decided to do this one in steps. I thought it would be easier if I did all the background first, and then did all of the purple petals first, and then do all of the yellow petals next, and then do all of the leaves next. So I'm just doing this in sort of like stages. And it made it a little bit easier. in some ways, and I thought it would be easier to follow. So of course on the next viola I'm doing the same thing. I wet the petals down that I want to be purple. I dropped in some of that purple violet, red violet, and then some of the deeper purple right along the edge for the shadow. I'm also taking a damp dry brush and lifting out some highlights here and there just to give it a little bit of depth and dimension. And you want your petals to have some depth and dimension, so you don't want them all to be one flat color. You want to have some darks, some lights, some mediums, and then some tones in between all of those as well. And my brush is a little bit dirty, so I just said heck with it. I'm just going to go ahead and drop this, wet it with whatever I've got on my brush, and just drop it in. And then right along the tip, I'm just coming back and pulling up some of that paint just along the edge, that top edge where the light's hitting it, and then going with the darker paint right along where that other petal is overlapping to give it a shadow. And I'm just going to continue to do that with all of my purple petals. I love violas because they are so easy, they are so tough, and they are really, really pretty to me. And I like that they can be like, they have the purple petals, and then they have also yellow petals like these do, or they can have all different kinds of petals on one little flower, all different colors, I should say, on one little flower. And then they have the little designs on their throats, which we'll do near the end. And I just think they are just the happiest little flowers ever. And I also made my violas like different sizes. You don't want to have all of them the same size. Make them some different sizes so that they either look like they're further away or closer to you. If they're larger, they're going to look like they're closer to you. If they're smaller, they'll look like they're further away. But it also gives visual interest to your painting too. So you want to think about things like that whenever you're painting. I know there's a lot to think about when you're painting. Color choices, technique, big, small scale, all kinds of things. How you going to get your texture in there, shadows, lights and darks. But you know, once you get the hang of it, once you've painted for a while, it all starts to come pretty naturally. It just takes a little while, and all it takes is practice. Now once I get all of the petals that are purple painted, I'm going to let them dry completely. Just let that dry completely. Don't do anything to it. Once it's dried completely, then we are going to start on our yellow petals. So what I'm going to do is, just like I did with the purple petals, we're going to do a little wash of, supposed to be clean water, but I've been mixing yellow with my brush, so the water's not that clean. But you'll want to do some clean water over the petal. I did like a lemony, really pale lemony color down on the bulk of it. Then up there near the center, I added just a little bit of cadmium yellow to darken that up. Again, I'm just painting clean water, and then I'm coming in with a really pale yellow, a really watery mix of a lemony yellow. And then right where the center starts to connect the petals all together, I'm just adding like a little drop of cadmium yellow. You could also use new gamboge. Just a deeper, warmer yellow goes there. And once I get all of these painted, I'm going to work on those two side petals. And they're also yellow, but they're a little bit lighter yellow, but it's a little bit, I really couldn't get the differentiation. Is that a word? I think it is, yeah. I couldn't get the differentiation between that bottom petal and those two side petals as far as the color goes, but I did my best. And of course, you want to let this dry because you don't want your two side petals to bleed into these either. So I let those dry as I went along. And while they were drying, I went ahead and we'll pretend they're dry. I went ahead and I wet each one of those side petals. And now what I did to try to make them a little bit lighter yellow, because they are a little bit lighter yellow, Then that bottom one is I mixed just a tiny, tiny bit of white gouache in there to soften up that lemony yellow. And then I tried to do more of the lemony yellow toward the center part, toward the inner edge of each one, without the white gouache, so that it would look darker. So that was what I was trying to do. It didn't really come out like the actual flowers look, but I'm not hating it. I'm not hating it at all. Actually, I really like this painting when I get done with it. It's actually one of my, how many times you reckon I can say actually in one video? But it is a favorite painting of mine. It's something I enjoy doing, inspired by my garden. I get so much, there is so much to paint in my garden year round. I just thought to myself, that's why I took a little turn on my channel and I'm starting to focus some on my garden as well, because that's what I really enjoy doing. I'm 59 years old. I just turned 59 years old in September, and I have decided that I don't have much more time left on this earth. And the time that I have, I'm going to, instead of trying to people please and make everybody else happy, trying to figure out what they want to see me paint or what they want to learn to paint, I'm just going to paint what I want to paint. So, you know, if you love garden things and flowers and bugs and animals, then okay, this is the place for you. But if that's not your thing, then hey, I'm sure there's plenty of channels out there that have something that you would like. So probably going to be leaning into more flowers, more nature, natural paintings than I have in the past. Even though those actually were a big part of my painting as well, my subject matter, but I'm going to really lean into the things that I love. All right, now I let those yellow petals dry completely before I started this green, and it's the same technique. I'm using the same technique throughout this whole painting. I've used a little bit of green gold, a little bit of sap green, hooker's green, and just a little bit of a blue green, or green blue. I'm not sure what the exact name of that color is, but it's a really bluish green color. It's got a lot of blue in it. I'm wetting each one of the leaves before. Then I am just dropping in the colors. Where I want it to be lighter, I'm dropping in that green gold mixed with a little bit of sap green. You could also mix a little bit of olive green if you want to try that. Then I'm lifting some of the excess with a damp, dry brush where I want it to stay light. Coming back while it's still wet, letting that water do the work for me. That is the best thing you could do, is just let the water do the work. I'm dropping in the darker greens so that it looks more like shadows. And I'm also doing the same thing with the stems, wetting them first, dropping in that really pale green gold, mixed with either sap green or olive green, up to you. And then while it's still wet, where I want the shadows, I'm just dropping in. And when I say I'm dropping in, all I'm doing is I'm getting my brush loaded up with the color and just touching an area where I want that darker green to be. So that's what I call dropping in. All I'm doing is loading up my brush and then just touching that wet area where I want that paint, that dark paint, to go. See, just like that. And I'm trying to concentrate on where I think the shadows would be on these leaves, but I'm not trying to make it overly realistic. I really want this to look like a painting. I want it to look painterly. That's my goal. I'm not adding a lot of details. I want to keep it simple. And I think that's why I enjoyed this one so much, because I didn't really have to focus on all the details and getting things realistic. I just went with what I thought would be pretty. I was more into pretty on this one than I was on to realism, if that makes sense. I mean, you can still tell it's violas with leaves. I mean, it's not like I went abstract or crazy or anything like that, but I just wanted to keep it simple, do a lot less, and see if I could still come up with something that I liked, and lo and behold, I did. Now that yellow, it's really hard on my camera. It's hard to pick that yellow up with my camera. It is so bright. I don't paint very much with yellow, come to think of it. So that's probably why I'm having a hard time with the camera. I'm not used to that bright yellow. But, you know, there we go. Now I'm just adding some shadows to that little bud. There's a little stem that's kind of curled over. It's about to bloom, but it'll be curled over until it blooms, and then it'll pop up, and a beautiful little viola blossom will come from that little green bud up there. I've got a little bit of yellow on it already because it's opening up. Now I'm going to let that dry a little bit. Once that's dry, then I am going to start working on maybe adding some of like another layer of yellow, just to put some texture on those petals. And it's just a little bit of yellow with some new gamboge and some of that lemon yellow mixed together. And I'm just doing a little bit of texture. Now this is what is wet on dry. The actual petals are dry, and I'm coming in, of course, with wet paint. Can't come in with dry paint. So this is a wet on dry. The paper is dry, and I'm just painting over it. When you do that, you have more control over where your paint stays. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get some texture on here. Before we used wet on wet, and that let all the colors mingle. We had the paper wet and then let all the colors mingle on the paper. But for this, I want the paint to stay exactly where I paint it to give it some of that texture. So I'm letting the paper is dry, and I'm just painting on dry paper. That's when you have the most control on your watercolor, but it's also doesn't have that beautiful spontaneity that watercolor is so famous for. Now I'm taking a little bit of new gamboge, a little bit of yellow ochre mixed together, and going just right in the center of each one of these little violas, and giving some shadows to that little bud up there. I'm sorry I wasn't looking at the camera, and I didn't see that I had my painting up too far. But I just added some shadows onto that little bud up there. That's all. It's nothing earth-shattering, nothing you can't do on your own. I also noticed that these little violas have a purple, like, cone shape right on the very tip of each one of their bottom petals. So I came back in. I'm using my Golden Maple miniature brushes. I love those brushes. And I'm just painting that in. I'm painting it straight onto dry paper. So it's just wet on dry. I just want it to stay in that little triangle. I could come back and lift some of the paint if I want to put a little highlight in there. So that is how I am handling that little tiny spot on each one of those bottom petals. Now I'm just coming back in. I've wet the petal with some clean water, and I'm just kind of dabbing in some that darker hooker's green mixed with some of the blue green. I think my petals they're all too much one value, one tone. There's not a lot of contrast in them, so I'm just trying to come back and give it a little contrast to add a little more interest, since we're not doing a lot of detail work on these. So I'm going to have to get the interest, instead of from detail, from with, a high contrast, some really dark darks against some really light lights. And that'll make it more visually interesting without having to do all the veins and all the spots and all the blah. We're just going to try to get a good effect with the lightness and darkness with the contrast. So that's all I'm coming back and doing right now. And just darkening up some of those leaves. And I'm still using the wet on wet. And I'm being very careful not to rub those leaves with my brush too much, because that'll disturb that first layer that we put on, and I don't want to disturb that first layer, so I'm using a gentle touch with it, putting a little bit of clean water over it, and then just dropping in some of those darker colors to give it the contrast. So be very careful when you do this, if you do your painting like this, not to disturb that first layer of green or whatever colors that you're using. Don't disturb it, so just use a really light touch. Now I'm going back to my purple. These little violas have little lines coming from the center of them on their petals, little purple lines. So I'm just going to paint those in there. I think it needs them, even though I was trying to avoid doing too many details. I think that's kind of an important part of these violas that really, stands out. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint those little tiny lines. Again, make sure your yellow is completely dry before you do this, because you don't want your purple to bleed into some wet yellow, because you're going to have an ugly brownish gray that you don't want. So make sure the yellow is completely dry before you put these tiny little lines in, so that it doesn't bleed. And yes, that just sort of perks them right up. I really like the way that looks. Yeah, I like doing the little lines inside. That adds a little something something to it. Now I'm just coming in with a little bit of a darker yellow just toward the center, so that it is darker toward the center. And that, of course, gives a little depth. And I'm just pulling it out and just doing tiny little brush strokes out from it, again, to add a little texture. And I'm doing that on wet on dry, so the paper is dry. Again, that's where you have your most control. I am loving these little violas. They are so cute. I'm glad I bought them from the nursery. I swear, when I walked by them, they screamed out, "Viv, we over here. Come buy us. You need us." And I had hostas in that pot that I put them in, that I showed you at the beginning of the video. I had hostas in there. I took those out. I divided those, and I got 12 hostas out of that one little pot. So I'm going to have a bunch of hostas for next year. I potted them up and put them out by my greenhouse. Anyway, they were hollering my name, and I love violas. I love pansies. And then I saw that ornamental cabbage, and it had the same purple on the inside of the veins. I thought, oh, these would go really good together in my little pot. So yeah, that's what I got. I've never grown ornamental cabbage before, so I'm going to see how that works out. I've seen other people do it, and I've admired their ornamental cabbage, because I'm nosy. I'm always looking to see what people have in their pots and their yards and stuff. Well, and so I'm going to try it this year. I'll let you know how it goes. And I'm just doing a little fussy work right now, but I am pretty much finished. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. Big shout out to my patrons. Love you guys. See you soon.